Now, a few words about Meena. After being born and raised in India and earning a master's degree here in D.C. from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, she served for a time as a development consultant and then pursued a varied career in journalism. Early on, she worked at the World Bank in D.C. as well as for the Ashoka Society. At the end of the 1980s, she moved to London and became a foreign correspondent for NDTV. 7 years later, she returned to the U.S. and went on to do freelance reporting and writing for a range of publications. In A Matter of Trust, Meena examines the often complicated relationship between the world's two largest democracies over the past 70 years since India's independence. She says in her acknowledgments that she wrote the book both for Indian and American readers and intended it not so much for academia, but for ordinary people to enjoy history. Indeed, the book, while extensively researched, is very accessible and engagingly frames the story of U.S.-India relations around key individuals involved on each side. As Meena explains, the tone and temperature of relations between these two major powers has largely reflected the personal interactions between the leaders of the two countries. In fact, she writes, the only time the relationship has developed any real momentum has been when one of the leaders has shown a willingness to make a leap of faith. Meena will be elaborating on that and much more in a minute in conversation with Edward Luce, who is U.S. national editor at the Financial Times and also a columnist at the paper. Additionally, he's written several books, including one about a decade and a half ago on the rise of modern India called In Spite of the Gods.
I didn't get that.
In Spite of the Gods. By me. But that's the last reference to anything I wrote.
That was perfect timing.
Yeah.
I think we'll just leave that on the tape, too. I mean, we won't even bother to edit that one out. Anyway, we're delighted to have Ed moderating this afternoon. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Meenakshi Ahamed and Edward Luce.
Thank you very much, Brad. It's always a pleasure to be here. And even though it's Memorial Weekend and lots of people we know are away, this is being filmed. So C-SPAN Radio and C-SPAN Book TV, I hope, will run this in addition to your YouTube site. So thank you for those who are here this weekend and for turning up. It's a real pleasure to be here with my old friend, my long-standing friend, not old. No, not old. Meena Ahamed, who I've known for 15 or so years, and have discussed a lot of India with her over that period of time and watched the development of this book, and can strongly recommend that you not just buy it but read it. I know how hard it is to write a book, and you, I think, found everybody alive who had the memory of earlier US and Indian leaders and their diplomatic interactions, and also all the contemporary figures. So you've talked to everybody, and this book reflects that. Now we're going to get into what Meena's written about, which is a chronological from Truman to Trump, which is kind of in one sense, a descent of the evolutionary ladder. But that's my last editorial comment. And Nehru to Modi is also a bit of a ladder. But we'll get into that in a moment. But Meena, I want to kick off by asking you about today, and then we'll get back to the beginnings afterwards. So we have, of course, Russia invading Ukraine. We have Biden uniting the West. And we have Biden framing it as a global challenge between autocracy and democracy, the largest of which in the world is India. And yet India is abstaining. At the UN, it's refusing to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which puts, your book's called A Matter of Trust. Sometimes, I felt in reading it, it could be called a matter of distrust or mistrust. But it does highlight the awkwardness that you deal with over the 70, 80 year relationship of India not dancing to the tune that we in the West would sometimes like to see it dance to. Just talk to us a little bit about why India is abstaining and what that means.
Thank you, Ed. So I do have a piece in the Atlantic in the Atlantic magazine that deals with this, but I'll elaborate for those who haven't had a chance to look at it. So India, when India became independent, the Iron Curtain was descending across Europe, and so India being a nation that was emerging out of colonialism did not want to tether itself to another Western alliance. And it wasn't that it was anti-Western, it was more that it was pro-India. And they wanted, so Nehru, India's first prime minister, chose the path of neutrality. He also firmly believed that you needed some countries to be neutral so that there would be corridors of exchanges possible where people could come and make compromises with each other. So it was, he did not want to be in a position to have to make a choice. And unfortunately, in the US at the time, the sentiment was very much, we're in this Cold War, you're either with us or against us. And there were people who, Truman, John Foster Dulles, they all felt that neutrality was in a sense immoral. They were so consumed with they were so preoccupied with the Cold War in Russia that they felt that India's choice of neutrality was an immoral choice. And so there was a clash right there from the beginning. Now, neutrality, it's interesting because neutrality, as you know, Sweden was neutral for many, many years and is now considering joining NATO and throwing its backing behind. So why has India not done the same as Sweden? Or why is India not willing to sort of fulfill its obligations of a true strategic partnership with the US, which is what it has become now? And that is because a couple of reasons. One, I think the entire civil service government in India still embraces this concept of neutrality. They want India to be independent. It has the endorsement of the people. They don't want to be, they don't want to have to choose sides. So that's one. But the really big problem is that over the years, India has had several wars with Pakistan and one with China when China invaded in '62. And at the time, the US was unwilling to really provide India with the sort of equipment and advanced technology that India required. But Russia was very willing to come in and help India. They also were a very reliable vote for India at the UN. They were looking for regional balance, and so they supported India. But India's military is currently 50% or over 50% of India's military is bought from Russia. So, but when you look at the spare parts, it's almost 90%. Now, India's made an effort to diversify its military in the last 20 years, ever since relations with the US improved. But it takes time to overhaul your entire military and all its equipment and retrain everyone. So going from 90% to 50% has been quite remarkable, but it's still 50%. And, with China just recently, they had some border issues, and China sort of occupied quite a bit of India's territory in 2020. And so India can't really afford to just jettison the whole relationship with Russia. And so now where they were aligned with the US was with China. India's always had issues with China, and the US, and it started out that way, where the US always supported India as a frontline state against Chinese expansionism in the early days. Now we're back to the same situation. And So they are totally aligned on their China policy. But now the US, with its invasion of Ukraine and asking India to take a position against Russia, has put India into a really terrible dilemma. Because they don't want to join sanctions. They see that, it's not, that what, the Russians have done, they've violated borders and that's not acceptable. But they really can't sort of stand there and take a strong stand against Russia for several reasons, but the military being the main one.
It's a good answer. I mean, and deeply discounted Russian oil is sort of a nice sweetener, right?
Right.
But let's not get into that. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to frame this. And just thinking of what India saw itself as, which you describe really well in your book, as a moral superpower.
Yes.
As a champion of self-determination, anti-colonialism, disarmament, non-alignment. It saw itself as a moral superpower. The United States, of course, is a literal superpower, undisputably, but it also sees itself as a moral superpower, as a sort of almost providential vehicle of freedom, of human freedom, and of exceptionalism, the American exceptionalism. So we have two fairly self-regarding moral superpowers. You're going to have some irritations, right?
Right.
You're going to have some rubbing up each other the wrong way sort of instances. And that's kind of how it begins with Nehru.
Right. So Nehru felt that India had achieved independence through Gandhian nonviolence. It was unique. It was done without, without massive amounts of bloodshed. That came later during partition. So they felt that they did have a sort of feeling of moral superiority in their aspirations and ideals and the way that they founded the country. He was also against nuclear power. Nehru campaigned quite assiduously. He inaugurated India's Atomic Energy Commission, but for peaceful means. But he was really against nuclear power. He thought it was a terrible thing. He thought they were going to destroy the planet, and he irritated the Americans when he campaigned vigorously against it. And during his time, nuclear power in India was used for peaceful purposes. It was only under Mrs. Gandhi that changed. So I think that India also sees, when the U.S. always says that they promote democracy around the world, and today you see that in the phrase autocracy versus democracy, but sometimes they deal with the Saudis, they deal with dictators, they deal with military, they have military relationships with countries who have, military dictators. So,
like Pakistan.
Like Pakistan, but other countries as well. And so I think that they come across as being somewhat hypocritical sometimes to other countries. So, so they just feel that the U.S. really isn't consistent. It doesn't always walk the walk or walk the talk.
Okay, well, so let's get into the personalities, because so much of it is about the chemistry or lack of chemistry between various leaders. Now, Nehru, who is famously called the last Englishman to rule India, had been at this very
educated at Harrow
exactly.
and Cambridge, and very erudite. He'd written several books. Yes, he was.
And so he had some of the manners of the Edwardian gentleman.
Right.
And there you have Truman from Independence, Missouri, from a background as a haberdasher, who had actually, a little factoid from your book, 96 pairs of shoes, which is more than most men.
He was the best dressed president in U.S. history.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Well, I found this really remarkable thing, and there was someone who used to design some of his shoes for them. They actually have it. If you dig around enough in the internet, you'll find it. These shoes were amazing.
Let's stick to India-U.S. relations. Yes,
but I have
because we could go deep down the rabbit hole of shoes. I noticed it was a mistake to mention that.
They were embroidered. They were silk. There were different colors. I mean, they were quite fantastic.
No, okay, that's noted. Truman saw Nehru as a commie.
Yes.
And when Chester Bowles, one of Truman's advisors, was offered, as you write in your book, any ambassadorship he wanted, he said, "I want Delhi."
He was shocked, yeah.
Truman was shocked, right?
Yeah. Why India?
Why would you want to?
Isn't that a place where people walk around on coals, on hot coals, and yet there are tigers running around the street? Yeah, he had a very primitive view of India. But Truman, you have to remember that Franklin Roosevelt only allowed Truman into one foreign policy meeting during the time when he was vice president. He kept him out. Truman didn't have a great deal of foreign policy exposure. He was a very experienced politician, but in domestic politics. And so all of a sudden, the untimely death of President Roosevelt, and he's now put in this position of dealing with the aftermath of World War II. And I think he rises to the occasion, and Derek Liebart here is an expert on that and has written many books. And we've had some arguments about this, but but in terms of India, he wasn't terrific. He had very little understanding or interest, and I found buried in some Princeton archive a very interesting conversation between the Supreme Court Justice Douglas and Truman. Douglas used to go every summer to visit a different country. And most of these Princeton archives about Douglas's various cases and in the Supreme Court. But here he talks about his interaction with Truman, and he said he was going to India. Truman heard about it and called him into the White House and said, "Listen, I want you to go to Delhi and spend time with that man Nehru." And he said, "Yes, I'm going to New Delhi and be happy to do so. It's on my agenda." And he said, "He was sitting in that chair where you're sitting now, and he is a commie." And he said, "When you come back, I want you to come and tell me about it." And so, Douglas goes to India. He spends many hours with Nehru. They discuss the Constitution. They discuss, the rule of law, how you set up a new country. And Nehru is fascinated by all this stuff. He considered himself a sort of philosopher as well. And he was an intellectual. And so they had wonderful evenings, dinners, walks. So he comes back and he says to the president, he said, "Well, Mr. President, I met Nehru." And he says, and he said, "Wasn't he a commie?" And he says, "No, he's no more a commie than you or I. But he just wants to bring this very poor country out of poverty." And so he said, Truman just literally exploded. And he said, he sat in that chair, and I can smell commies a mile away, and that man was a commie if I ever saw one. And the Justice Douglas says, it was like blowing into the wind. You just could not convince this haberdasher from Missouri about, they were like chalk and cheese. Here was this very erudite, educated at Harrow and Cambridge Nehru, who writes books and thinks and loves to hang out with philosophers. And there's Truman, who, has his whiskey drinking buddies, and they just did not, who's, for him, the world was black and white at the time. You were either a commie or you were either on one side or the other. And he just didn't understand Nehru, and he didn't understand neutrality, or didn't accept it.
So let's go. I'm cognizant of the time because I want to get through some of the presents, not each of them, but the highlights. And just one more question about Nehru, his great sidekick, who rubbed everybody up the wrong way, and it was a deep anti-American, was Krishna Menon, the Indian ambassador to the UN. He gave the longest speech ever to the UN, 7 hours on Kashmir, until Castro beat his record.
And it didn't help Kashmir or the case.
And then Eisenhower had John Foster Dulles, a zealous Cold War warrior, a Christian. Clearly, these two really exacerbated things. But I wanted to mention one vote Krishna Menon took on Nehru's behalf at the UN. The Soviet Union had invaded Hungary, and India abstained. And that caused huge problems between Eisenhower and Nehru. And of course, there are echoes today of those problems. I guess what I want to ask is, was this sort of predetermined? I mean, there are personalities here, but there are also who make things worse, but there are also just clashing interests.
So I'll just mention something quick about the book. So I tried to divide the book up by U.S. presidents. And I tried to see who the main characters were on each side during each presidency that either made the relationship good or bad. And tried to examine, their diaries, their letters, everything, just to see, what drove the relationship. And Krishna Menon, just in the same way that John Foster Dulles rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, Krishna Menon was really disliked, not just by the Americans, but he was disliked by every single member of the Indian diplomatic corps. They would do things to build bridges in the US, and Krishna Menon would just waltz in and blow it all up. So they all really disliked him. And I'll just read a quote that Galbraith writes about him. He was very acerbic, and his journal is worth reading in itself because Kennedy whenever Galbraith sent a cable to Washington, it was passed around to everyone in the State Department. They all wanted to read it because they were so amusing. And Kennedy had instructed everyone to send them straight to him. And he Menon visits the US to sort of try and put forth some ideas and repair some damage. And Galbraith said, sending Menon visited the US on the 22nd of December, 1961. And Galbraith said that it was like the use of a gasoline hose, using a gasoline hose as a fire extinguisher. That was what it was to send someone like Menon. And he said he just couldn't understand what the Indians were thinking. But he definitely helped destroy a lot of relationships.
Now, I hesitate to mention the so-called royal visit of Jackie Kennedy to Delhi, and the 64 suitcases and 22 changes of outfit in the 9-day visit, because I don't want to get into a sartorial discussion. It would just...
Clothes were great.
But I should mention a very poignant thing in your book. After India's humiliation and the breaking of Nehru in the China-India War of 1962. Of course, Nehru then dies a broken man. But the last thing he read, what was open on the side of his bed, his deathbed, was the Robert Frost poem, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, which is a very poignant sort of end to a broken man.
Right. So Jackie Kennedy, so Nehru had come to visit Kennedy, and the visit had not gone well. And I describe it in my book. You can read it. Some of it had to do with Nehru not being well and coming here and it not being detected, and it was sort of criminal that someone didn't take him to Walter Reed. But he wasn't far away from dying at the time, but he didn't know it. But Kennedy had admired Nehru, and he was surprised that the visit was so poor and that Nehru had performed so poorly, because normally Nehru would jump down 3 steps at a time, give great speeches, love to take on the press. So this was unusual. And right after Nehru returns to India, India takes over Goa. And it was a Portuguese colony. The French had given their colonies back to India, but the Portuguese had held out. And Galbraith had suggested they buy it. No, Ellsworth Bunker, had suggested they buy it. And India had tried everything, but the Portuguese refused. And so basically, to cut a long story short, India takes it over. And the Portuguese, of course, call on all their European allies to demonstrate against this, and they hold a funeral march in Portugal for the loss of Goa, etc., etc. But the U.S. is very upset, not because they were supporting any colonial ambitions, because they really didn't, as Galbraith very puts it in another sarcastic note, that I'm not someone who's a fan of a whole lot of brown people being, ruled by some European despot. But I think the U.S. was upset that they hadn't been forewarned. They felt that Nehru had just visited, had spent time at the White House with JFK, and why hadn't he given them a heads up? And so Jackie Kennedy was sent to India. She goes there almost like a peace offering, because relations really deteriorated after Goa. And she comes and she just wows everyone. I mean, it's the first time she comes with all these beautiful clothes. Nehru is enchanted with Jackie, and he's much better now. And he just holds her hand, and he insists that she come and stay with him, and takes her and her sister Lee Radziwill everywhere. And they just, it's a very successful visit. She manages to do what most diplomats and ambassadors weren't able to do, and certainly what no policymaker was able to do, which is repair the relationship just by this visit. And Indians were thrilled because the images coming out of India were usually one of poverty, and all of a sudden there's all this glamour, her sitting in front of the Taj, her on a, elephant going up this Jaipur, castle. So it really helped. And it helped just in time because right after her visit in 1962, the Chinese invade India. And India now needs the U.S., and they turned to the U.S. And Galbraith and Nehru really did. I mean, Galbraith and JFK did everything they could to help India then. And the relationship, I think, would have turned and changed for the better had it not been for the fact that they both died. Kennedy was assassinated shortly afterwards, and Nehru passed away right after that.
A very key turning point. I'm going to skip over Indira and LBJ. There's a very interesting chapter.
And Kissinger.
If that's the high point. The low point is Nixon Kissinger, and the 1971 war that led to the creation of Bangladesh. The blood telegram and so forth. Now we have India intervening on the side of the East Pakistanis, the Bangladeshi nation, but we have Kissinger really valuing close relations with Pakistan, because Pakistan is the conduit to China for the grand Nixon Shanghai Communique Initiative, Nixon in China, the big chessboard move. And so Nixon and Kissinger are particularly anti-Indian when India invades East Pakistan. You very judiciously leave out some of the more salty quotes that Kissinger uses about Indira Gandhi to Nixon, some really, really quite crude, nasty language about not just Indira Gandhi, but about Indian women. And you mentioned this really key fact that I think has been forgotten, at least here, that because there'd been this US-China rapprochement, Kissinger encourages the Chinese to invade, to open another front with Indira Gandhi's India. He actually encourages communist China to attack democratic India and risk a world war. It's an extraordinary moment, and the reason why I emphasize this is not just because it is the most notorious chapter in US-India relations, but also because when we think of today and the framing of democracy versus autocracy, I think this lingers in the sort of deep recesses of India's foreign policy establishment memory, right? That India was a democracy there. Pakistan and China weren't.
So it's called Tortured Relations, that chapter, and if you read just one chapter, maybe you want to read that. Nixon had this idea, even before he became president, that his legacy was going to be written with China, with the opening to China. He was obsessed by it. They pursued they once chased two Romanian ambassadors, in Vienna, and these Romanians just ran away because they were trying to convince them to find a conduit to China, and they dropped that whole lead. But Pakistan proved to be the right source for them. And there was unfortunately in Pakistan, there was a civil war going on, and it's something that it was very inconvenient for Kissinger and Nixon. And they decided that they were going to ignore the advice of their own embassies in Bangladesh and as to what was going on between the East and West, that time East and West Pakistan. And they were just going to pursue their China initiative. Actually, there was a big decoy, and they were supposed to go to India, and Kissinger, they said he had a bad stomach. He actually ended up getting a bad stomach, so the Indians always said that was a curse on him. But when Indira Gandhi entered the war and the Pakistanis were defeated, one of the things that the U.S. did, that Kissinger did, was that they asked the USS Enterprise to come in. This was a nuclear-armed ship that they asked them to come into the Bay of Bengal. That was a sort of nuclear threat that the Indians never forgot. And Ambassador Keating, who was the American ambassador in New Delhi, was shocked, and he thought, what were the Americans trying to do? And he was a big supporter of Nixon, and he actually contacted Nixon and Kissinger, and they just brushed him off. And they were hell-bent on this. But this China front that Ed brings up was really shocking, because Kissinger tried to inflame the whole situation and could have raised it into some sort of real nuclear or sort of a real war if China had entered the picture. The Chinese actually, luckily, thought better of it and didn't do anything, but not because Kissinger didn't try. He thought that if we open up this other front, India is going to get completely encircled, and we're going to get India. He really disliked India, and so did, and he's changed his mind over the last years. You know, now we all think of Kissinger as this wonderful diplomat of the century. That's the sort of way that he's promoted. But in 1971, he was not like that. You know, if you read Haldeman's diaries, Haldeman and Nixon were constantly worried about Kissinger's the state of his mental health. He was so anxious about Will Rogers, who was Secretary of State, and going around his back, and there was constant petty fighting and politics that were going on in the White House and between the NSC, and it was, and when Nixon would go on about how much he disliked India, rather than tamping him down and trying to be more rational, Kissinger actually would dial it up and say, oh yeah, you know, aren't they terrible? And you know what, they also did this, and they're going to rape Pakistan, and this, that, and the other. And he was not the diplomat of the century at the time. And even when it came to China, he was so beside himself about all the arrangements. At one point, Haldeman called him into his office and said, well, you know, he's always threatening to resign. And so he said, well, you know, we've decided to accept your resignation. And Kissinger was stunned. And he said, but that, of course, means you can't go to China with the president. And Kissinger, for days, just couldn't sleep or eat. And apparently, you know, then he came around and he sort of stopped threatening to resign all the time. But read Haldeman's diaries are fascinating on Kissinger.
No, they are gripping, and Galbraith's too.
Yeah.
So it's no surprise, I guess, I don't want to dwell on this, but it's no surprise that 3 years after the USS Enterprise is sent into the Bay of Bengal in such a menacing posture, that Indira Gandhi conducts the first peaceful nuclear test, a kind of oxymoronic. Let's not dwell on that. Let's just fast forward to the next overt nuclear test of 1998, which happens under the Clinton administration. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the first Hindu nationalist BJP prime minister, is in charge. George Fernandez is defense secretary. This produces the last sort of moral censure of India before relations really start to improve. And our mutual friend, Stroke Talbot, of course, was the one who tried to build bridges. Then 9/11 happens, and America loses any sense of misgiving about the nuclearization of India. India is the first country, even though it's not a treaty ally of the United States, the first country to say we will help in any way that we can. Describe to me the unlikely role of George W. Bush, being the man who, along with Vajpayee and then Manmohan Singh, cements this de facto alliance between India and the US.
So, I mean, I'm a Democrat, and, you know, I wrote a couple of op-eds, against George Bush's foreign policy when he was president. So I hardly meant to make him the hero of my book, but he does come across as the person who really changed the relationship with India and reset it so that it's a partnership today. So there were years of accumulated mistrust between the two countries. You know, it started with Nehru and non-alignment. It went into Johnson and his terrible food policy with India, where, because Mrs. Gandhi came out against Vietnam, he just saw red and stopped all these food shipments right when India was having a major famine, at the worst of it, the worst famine since independence. And so these things were seared into the minds of a lot of the people in India, that the U.S. really isn't for us. And then, of course, the Bangladesh War. There were millions of refugees that had come into India, and Mrs. Gandhi used that as an excuse, of course, to get involved in the war. And so I think, people just didn't trust. And when they censured India, when they exploded their nuclear device in '74, the Nuclear Supplies Group, this is kind of technical, but they were formed really to stop other countries from doing what India did. And they were censured by the U.S. There was a big project that supplied nuclear energy in India, and they stopped all the fuel shipments to that facility. So India felt that they were sort of being treated roughly by the U.S. And George Bush comes in, and he asks this very important question. He says, look, China's on the rise. We're going to be dealing with China for a long time, and we need allies in the region. And who do we have? And he had some interactions with Indian entrepreneurs who are now becoming quite prominent in the U.S. And he said, these people, we should make friends with them. And he asked the important question, what does India want? Why aren't we friends with them? And it's the first time that people actually asked India, what do they want? And the Indians said, and I've talked to a lot of Indian, foreign secretaries, etc., who said, we wanted to be recognized as a responsible nuclear power. And we don't want to be ostracized anymore. He said, we're self-sufficient in food, partly thanks to the rough Johnson policies. India made itself self-sufficient. But he said, you have China that's proliferated. They've shared their technology with Pakistan, with North Korea. The Pakistanis have proliferated, and India has not. So why are we not treated fairly? And so Bush actually thinks about this. He couldn't do anything in his first term, but in his second term, he goes all out to recognize India as a nuclear power. And to do this, he has to change existing U.S. law. And that meant getting Congress and the Senate on his side at a time when, if you remember, things were pretty fractured over the Iraq War. And so he wasn't exactly, a popular president at the time. The economy in his second term was starting to do badly. So this is a really overlooked achievement of his, because most of the other things were disasters. But this was a shining moment for Bush. And he went all out, and there were many, many times, and I hope that this chapter reads a bit like a thriller, because there were many times when this negotiation just went into the tank. I mean, literally, people said that Steve Hadley and people said they had to literally dive deep down and fish it out, because either the Indians there were times when the Indians were being obstreperous, and the Americans all got so fed up after hours and hours of negotiating, they walked out and took a flight and went back to Washington, and they said, that's it, the whole thing is over. And then, Bush and Manmohan Singh, the Indian Prime Minister, would say, no, get back to the table. What is it that we need to do to get this cleared? And they would go back and get it cleared. And all these hurdles, it was remarkable how much of a personal effort was put into this by Condi Rice, by Bush. There was one moment when the whole thing had collapsed, and Condi Rice said, that's it. If they want to be nuclear pariahs, let them be nuclear pariahs. And then she wakes up in the morning at 5 in the morning and said, no, I'm not going to let this go. And she marches off and knocks on the Prime Minister's door, literally. And, all the Indians are flummoxed. They don't know what to do. And the Prime Minister says, I don't want to see her because I don't want to say no to her. And his right-hand guy says, no, you have to see her. This is Condi Rice, and Bush is waiting to find out what's going on, and then finally they resurrect the whole thing and it all goes through. But it took years, and it happened right at the end of his presidency. But once this happened, the Indians began to think, oh, the US has finally come through. They've actually come through for us. This is the president who went all out with Congress, and they changed the law for us. So after this, the years of mistrust start to sort of disappear, and finally you have a relationship that where people begin to trust each other.
So let's. I'm going to ask a final, sort of quite scrunched up question because I want to get to the audience. Let's get back to the descent of the evolutionary ladder, from Truman to Trump, and from Nehru to Modi. The Modi-Trump relationship. You described the Howdy Modi rally in Houston. The fact that Trump's last overseas trip as president was to India, when Modi receives him in the Narendra Modi Stadium in Ahmedabad, 100,000 people. Trump loves it. It's a crowd. Trump doesn't know much about India at the beginning. He actually says to he says to Modi, "It's a good thing you don't have a border with China."
Yeah, I know.
Which is
a famous line.
It's an interesting view of the longest border in the world. But we've got to a stage now where I mentioned at the beginning, India's the largest democracy in the world, where that phrase begins to stick in my throat. Now, I know you feel strongly. Nehru, your admiration for Nehru shines through in the book. But we have a prime minister who is dismantling systematically the Nehruvian legacy of inclusive, integrated secularism and turning India arguably into a Hindu Pakistan. For how much longer can we call India the world's largest democracy? It's certainly the world's largest illiberal democracy, sort of Viktor Orban times 100. But for how long can we continue to call it that? And does it matter from America's point of view? Whatever India is, it's a bulwark against China, right?
Right. So right now, India is once again playing the role of the frontline state against Chinese expansionism. And China, as you know, has been, they took over the Sekulu Islands. They've been the whole, Belt and Road Initiative, getting, sort of, giving lots of money to different countries in the East. So India has, the US feels like they need India right now because obviously India does not have good relations with China. So it's part of the Quad, but as you all know that everyone else in the Quad voted to sanction Russia and India didn't. So it's a member of the Quad, yet it doesn't always follow what the Quad is doing. It still has reluctance to fully adhere to what the US asks it to do. I'll just digress here. I'm really worried about India's future because, the population, 60% of the population is under 30, just like Pakistan, like a lot of these countries. And they don't really, another 6 years of Modi, they're not going to remember. We're going to have an entire generation that doesn't remember liberal democracy or India's democratic traditions. They're just going to remember Modi. And I'm also concerned that the US, in its urgency to combat a rising China and to have India in its corner, is going to overlook all the human rights abuses as well as the retreat from democracy under Modi. They've been intimidating the press. There's, all kinds of things, certainly with minorities, Kashmir. These are all serious things. And I would have hoped that Biden would have made a point of putting some pressure on them, but I don't think that he's in a position to do so right now. And that's worrying. And this current administration's big push has been autocracy versus democracy. And India has got an autocracy right now. And I sort of worry that just for political expediency, they're going to overlook a lot of these things. so we can open up to questions.
So we've got about 15 minutes for questions. This is being recorded. This is being filmed. So any questioners would have to use that microphone for audio purposes. And I invite all of you. I mean, Mina, let's try and get through as many as we can. Peter, I won't decapitate you if you give your full biography, but keep it short, non-statement.
This is not a
That's
statement.
Peter Bergen from the CNN terrorism analyst.
This is a question about Modi. I mean, what are his sort of electoral prospects in the long term? Are there sort of term limits? Is there any is he dictator for life? And what does the future look like for him?
I think the future for him looks good. The opposition is in disarray, and you have. He's just going to win very easily in the next election, and he, like Trump, has appealed to a certain, large majority of the Indian people on religious grounds, and that seems to have been popular. And it's distracted people from some of his economic challenges and failures and his inability to deliver on that front. It's the banking system is under stress. If you look at, China, the recent 2020 incursion, I mean, the Chinese basically have taken Indian territory and now has built a massive amount of infrastructure around it. And so I think of that as a big foreign policy failure for him, but it's not advertised in India. And nobody's really being that critical about it.
Priya.
So, Meena, what kind of partnership can India expect with America in the next
Well, that's a
5
great
years?
question. And I'll mention that Priya's grandfather was the second ambassador to the U.S. from India, and a very well-known one.
G.L. Mehta.
G.L. Mehta, he did a lot. I think that India has worked hard. Modi made this a cornerstone of his foreign policy to be friends with the U.S. I think this whole Ukraine thing has kind of put a little twist into everything for him. It's made it difficult. But I think that what I think the U.S. is going to be able to achieve with India is incremental, small pockets where they line up, like China, having partnerships and agreements on that. Because I just don't see how in the next 5 years the dependence on Russia can change because of the military dependency. And there are a lot of people in the civil service that think of Russia as India's friend. Russia supported India through the years consistently. So there is a sentiment in India that the Russians are our consistent friends. And look, the U.S. has now sort of walked away from Pakistan in a way, right? They've certainly walked away from Afghanistan. So India looks at this and thinks, okay, well, we're their friends now. Will we be their friends? Will they be with us tomorrow? Where will we be tomorrow with the U.S.? So, people in India are reluctant to throw in their lot completely 100% with the U.S. for all these reasons.
Just quickly before getting you the quote, which I love in your book from Nehru, friendships are not monogamous. I think explains the difference between the Indian view of what diplomatic ties are, which is not marriage,
Yes.
and the American view, which is it's marriage.
This government adheres to a lot of what Nehru said, even though they want
Indeed.
to
No, that's a
dismiss
continuity.
Nehru. Yeah.
Sir,
Bill Courier is my name.
can you come a bit closer to the mic?
Yes. I would be interested in hearing you talk about American Indians of Hindus and their relationship and thoughts about Modi, and also the penetration that sort of Trump thinking has made into like Indian leadership, doctors, lawyers
Here. That's a very interesting question because the Carnegie Institute has, and Milan Vaishnav and Ashutosh Ghosh, they've undertaken some very extensive surveys of Indian attitudes in America. And what's fascinating is if you look at these surveys, when asked if they support affirmative action, pro-immigration policies, etc., in the U.S., the Indians are 100% for it. They're for affirmative action. They're against discrimination. They're all for equality with the races, and they're absolutely for immigration. They did a similar survey where they questioned them about India and the same sorts of questions about minorities' rights, equality, et cetera, and immigration, and they were very conservative because a lot of the people, of course, 80% of Indians are Hindus, and they seemed to be very pro-Modi, and they were pro-Modi's policies, and they did not translate their liberalism when it came to India. They had a double standard, which was sad.
Just to be precise, this is they're supporters of the Citizens Amendment Act, which kind of makes Muslims second-class citizens,
right.
Kind of.
Right. Well, the questions were actually more detailed about rights in general, and they did not think that India should have free immigration and all that sort of stuff.
Please.
Hi, Meg Hauge, friend of. Just wanted to ask, in terms of, I'm assuming half the country is female, and has Modi done anything in terms of putting more women politically up front, or what is India's relationship with women? I know it's a big question. That's probably another book, but I was just wondering in terms of...
It's not my expertise, my field of expertise, so I really feel hesitant to answer that question. Mm-hmm. I will say that traditionally, when children are born, you have pretty equal number of male surviving children and female surviving children. I think maybe a few more females survive. In India, it's the reverse, right? There's quite a big gap, and there are far more male children than female children. And that's because of female infanticide, neglect of female children, or if they're limited resources, not giving the female child adequate treatment, whatever, there's been a big gap. And that's kind of shocking. Yeah. Obviously, there's still a lot of misogyny existent in India, but I will say that, having said that, you also have a lot of women in government and medicine and professions, and they're all encouraged to get educated. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but it's not really my field of expertise, and I don't want to tread there because I'm sure there are a lot of civil rights groups in India that will say that women are completely at the bottom of the pile, and they are certainly in a lot of cases. But if you have, like a lot of countries, if you have access to education and wealth, you can climb out of it. And in India, you can get jobs, etc. So,
sorry, that might be a curveball, but I just thought politically,
it's not exactly my. I would be unhappy not having the statistics, not having studied the statistics on it. There's some things like the demographics of early child mortality rates and stuff that I could tell you that it goes against the women. Okay. The female child, but I don't know enough about the rest.
Well, we have time for one, depending on the brevity or not of the answers and the questions, maybe two more questions. Please.
Okay, so my question is, I think a little bit more in your wheelhouse. Obviously, India has a Obviously, India has India has had a long-standing conflict with Pakistan in the Kashmir region. And obviously today, a lot of the problems in Ukraine stem from Russia's occupation of the Crimea and parts of the Donbass. Yet every time that this has come up in the UN General Assembly, India has voted to either abstain or against, in a sense, not voting for something that is aligned with India's historical geopolitical interests in its own backyard. How does India square that, and what does that tell us about Indian foreign policy as a whole? Sorry for making it kind of complicated.
Yeah, no. So are you asking about the fact that they didn't vote to sanction Russia, and they've abstained from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc. In the past. And
I'm speaking more specifically, so from the 2014 invasion
Right.
to the 2022 invasion, they haven't really made any meaningful steps, despite India itself claiming, similarly to Ukraine, that parts of India are under foreign occupation. How does India justify to itself that?
yeah, it's a contradiction. You know, countries vote and act in their self-interest all the time. And I think India, you would think that the inviolability of borders would be in India's interest to uphold. So that's why, obviously, in the Ukraine case specifically, you would think that India would have voted theoretically. It's a theoretical issue, and based on theory, yes, India should have sanctioned them, but they're not going to sanction Russia because of the specifics of the country.
Okay, thank you.
And that cheap oil is coming in handy.
That is true.
That's right. It's the wrong note on which to end.
Well, there's not just the cheap oil. There's lots of investments that now the Russians want the Indians to make in their energy sector, and they have got a big oil refinery in India as well. So there's just a lot of other issues.
And the
as well.
S-400. But let's not get into that. Sorry, I'd have to go. We should end.
Well, I mean, it is actually it's an important point, the S-400, because India, having said that they were going to diversify their military, just contracted to get some very sophisticated equipment from Russia. Now the question is why? Because the U.S. actually wasn't. They said that they were going to help India out with military purchases, but they weren't willing to sell India the most advanced technology. There's still some hesitancy in the Pentagon about whether India would transfer it to a third party or the technology would go to Russia or whatever. I don't know what I haven't talked to the people in the Pentagon about this most recent thing, but the Russians immediately, they did this deal with India, and it was much cheaper than Western technology. So, yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate.
We do have a final question. If you can make it short and the answer short, because I know you're strict about time, so I want to be...
It's actually a Goa Story, which is...
A story?
This 1971, I was in Hong Kong with an Indian passport, and I took the hovercraft to Macau as a tourist. So when I got to the border, there was this Chinese person, Macau, with a little gun, and he wouldn't let me through. I said, well, just a tourist. He said, well, you have an Indian passport, and we are at war with you. So apparently peace was never declared between Portugal and India. So he actually wouldn't let me go. I mean, he had another guard come in, stand with a little gun next to me, and put me on the next hovercraft going back.
Thank you for the story.
Thank you. And thank you, Meena, for, congratulations, first of all, for a wonderful book.
Thank you.
I urge everybody to buy and read. And you'll be available to sign, right?
Yes.